perhaps no other century in human existence experienced the terrible and remarkable contrasts of the 20th century. The century was heroic and tragic, progressive and reactionary, forward-looking and frighteningly regressive. A century of contradiction, confusion, and massive change. But the nature of human beings had not changed, and it is that basic nature, more than anything else, which is the determining catalyst of human history, certainly the history of the 20th century. Faith and fate will focus on how all these events and occurrences impacted on one specific group of people. A people whose survival has defied the ravages and challenges not only of this century, but of the over 40 centuries that have led up to it. Faith and Fate, the story of the Jewish people in the 20th century. Episode 4, Ominous Skies, 1930 to 1939.
The Roaring Twenties came to an economically devastated end with the stock market crash of 1929 and the advent of the Great Depression. Most of the industrialized nations in the world were severely affected. In Europe, as well as the United States, millions of people were out of work.
Financial panic grips the world. For the majority, it means the interminable line outside factory gates, desperately hoping for a job that rarely comes. It means hunger and a march of the unemployed in the nation's capital. It started in America, but practically overnight an economic blizzard swept the world. In Japan, France, Britain, always the unemployed, the soup kitchens, the grinding poverty, and the despair.
The impact of the Great Depression upon the Jews in Europe was even greater than upon the Jews in the United States, because the Jews in Europe faced an endemic anti-Semitism without a depression. And the depression just exacerbated it. It just brought it to a head. And because of the fact of the grinding poverty, and because of all of the economic problems, people always look for a scapegoat. Well, the handy scapegoat in European history for 1,500 years has been the Jew. So whenever there's a problem, it's the Jew's fault.
To understand the 1930s and Hitler's and the Nazis' autocratic rise to power in Germany, we need to understand 4 critical factors. 1. Germany was bankrupt. And with the German and European economies devastated, there were no jobs, and Germans were finding it increasingly harder to put food on their tables. 2. Germany had lost World War I, and Germans were under the crushing war debt of trillions of dollars imposed upon them by the Versailles Peace Treaty. 3. Germany, once a world imperial power, had had its pride crushed by the Allied victory. And 4. Germany and its impotent democratic government had no leadership that could solve Germany's problems. But Adolf Hitler understood the mood and the needs of the German people, and he had answers to solve their problems.
Keinem etwas zu Leide tun und von keinem ein Leid dulden.
In 1930, the Nazi Party wins a very respectable 107 seats in the Reichstag. How to explain this? From a non-entity in 1925 to the leader of a major party in the Reichstag in 1930, only 5 years. This is due to Hitler's incredible charisma, Even his greatest enemies admitted this. But it's not only that. He is fine-tuning his political message. He downplays sometimes attacks against the Jews, picks up the attacks against the communists, the natural enemy of the right wing, and goes on a huge media campaign, flying all over Germany, using the radio effectively, massive speeches to the crowds, dressing as a bourgeois almost, getting rid of the Austrian lederhosen, but wearing a suit and so forth. He comes across as somebody respectable who will appeal both to the bankers who are worried if the communists come to power, the middle class who always are worried about Jewish competition, and some workers who also are pulled in by the idea that he's saying the Jews are too materialistic and so forth.
Hitler pitched several themes over and over and over again, so that nobody could afterwards claim they had been fooled or misled. He pitched the concept of German racial superiority, which entitled them to vast conquests. You therefore needed to change drastically the domestic situation in Germany, end the multi-party system which had existed, get rid of any Jewish presence and influence, rebuild Germany's military power. There was a very strong sense of, we can do it, we will do it, and this is the way we'll do it.
In 1931, even though more than 13 million Germans voted for the Nazi Party in the parliamentary elections, Hitler and his party still did not have full power. Using increased violence against his opposition and his powers of persuasion to swing more and more Germans to his side, Hitler stepped up the pressure to take control of Germany. Hitler's brown shirts, while continuing their assaults on the Jews, now assassinated leading socialists, communists, and leaders of democratic parties.
There's genius in operation here because he's pushing the right buttons for every individual. One, the Christian argument, although he's certainly a pagan in belief, that the Jews rejected Jesus as Messiah. The dual loyalty argument of the secular enlightened people, that their loyalty is not to Germany but to elsewhere. The protocols of the elders of Zion, that the Jews are really an international race, conspiring to control the entire world. And most important, the Jews are the Aryan enemy. It's a race of parasites. They're trying to control and literally suck the blood out of vibrant Germany and other Aryan white pure races. It's a fight to the finish, and it's a war that we must win lest they annihilate us, lest they exterminate us.
Hitler understood that if you said something, even if it was untrue, enough times, especially if you said it convincingly, people would believe it. The Nazi propaganda machine continuously and successfully demonized the Jews. Der Stürmer, a Nazi newspaper, was filled with articles and cartoons which showed the Jews to be subhuman, equating them with vermin and rats. Films, including films of Hitler's speeches extolling German superiority and stressing the demonic inferiority of the Jews, were especially convincing and effective.
The idea that the Jews were not really humans in the ordinary sense was with the Nazis from the very beginning. From the Nazi point of view, the Jews were the Satan. They had inherited that idea from Christian anti-Semitism, where the Jew was considered to be possessed by Satan because only somebody possessed by Satan could have killed God, that's Jesus Christ. Unless the Jews were removed in some way, not only the physical survival of the German people was in danger, but the whole world would be conquered by Bolshevism and Jewish capitalism. Well, the counter-argument is that this whole thing is a nightmarish delusion. The Jews were slightly less than 17 million all over the world. They did not control anything at all. They had no territory. They had no political presence. This is many years before the establishment of the State of Israel. If you look at the American, British, French archives, you see that they consider the Jews at the most as a very unfortunate group of people who had no power.
By the early 1930s, Hitler had electrified many, many Germans in his sense of world conquest, to bring back German honor, to get rid of Jewish materialist influence. What he does also is, with the aid of people like Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, and in these massive demonstrations at Nuremberg where the party congresses are held, you basically see people swept aside by the aura, not only of Hitler's presence coming at the end as a mighty crescendo, but just the masses of Nazi soldiers marching in perfect formation. A massive ceremony, a spectacle, where the Savior, the Messiah, Hitler, comes at the end in his Mercedes-Benz, and people are literally swept away gleefully, hands shooting forward, Heil Hitler, Heil Hitler, Heil Hitler.
To understand how the majority of Germans were swayed by Hitler, we need to see exactly how masterfully he manipulated them.
He developed the manipulation of large numbers of people in a process in which vast numbers are in uniform in marching columns, and the others are standing by the side of the road in huge numbers cheering. They were playing a critical role in the development of what the Germans call the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community. And you were tied to your fellow Germans either because you were marching between two of them or you were cheering among tens of thousands of them. The Germans refer to their own people and their own soldiers with the word Menschenmaterial, human material. People, in other words, are converted essentially into something like bricks. And you use bricks the way you want to make a sidewalk, to build a house, or to throw at somebody. But they are, if you will, at the disposal of the regime, exactly the way bricks are at the disposal of bricklayers.
Forget hours, forget working conditions, forget how to think. Forge the club of blood and iron. Let the democracies talk about freedom. No freedom here. No labor unions. No overtime. The Führer tells you where to work, when to work, how long to work, how much your work is worth. Forge the club of blood and iron. We have a sacred mission. Today we rule Germany. Tomorrow, the world.
There is a suggestive power to this kind of showmanship, parades, decorations and events that seduces large numbers who might have been uncommitted to come to commit themselves alongside their fellow citizens.
And I came across an incredible story. A young woman who was fortunate to get out of Germany in time before World War II, who said, "What's this all about, Hitler and everything? A Jewish girl. I want to see for myself." She took off the yellow star. She could pass as a so-called Aryan, made it to one of the Nuremberg rallies, and was just sitting there. She found herself so transfixed by the drama, the aura, the strobe lights, Hitler's ranting but charismatic voice, the thousands of people around, the serried ranks of the SS and the army, that her hand shot forward unconsciously. Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil! When I read that for the first time years ago, I then began to understand the incredible, magical power of that evil genius whom we call Adolf Hitler.
Hitler somehow had a magnetic personality. People were mesmerized by him. If he fixed his blue eyes on you, then you were paralyzed. It was a demonic force. One of my earliest memories is how my parents were white, ashen, listening to his screeching, screaming voice, which came over the radio in our home. He could control millions through his speeches. And therefore you have here another anomaly that exists. Hitler is the most non-Aryan looking person in Germany. Dark hair, that silly Chaplin-esque mustache, small in stature, not a very great military bearing. Hindenburg called him that little corporal. Well, that's what he was. But somehow that little corporal was able to sell the idea of Aryanism and that he was the great representative of it, even though if you looked at him, he was not. He was looking for blonde, 6-foot, blue-eyed, Scandinavian-looking population. He couldn't fit the bill himself. So that's part of the mystery. I think Hitler is a mystery.
The evil forces of Nazism in Germany were gathering steam. But in the early 1930s, no one outside Germany seemed to take Hitler too seriously. But the propaganda-inspired hatred was building and began to erupt on the streets of Berlin and other German cities.
In the 1920s, Hitler wrote his book, Mein Kampf, and in Mein Kampf he said exactly what he was going to do, and he did exactly what he said he was going to do. All of his points were clearly spelled out. Nobody took him seriously. First of all, the book made him a very wealthy man. And secondly, the book became the Bible, so to speak, of the Nazi Party, of what would happen in Germany, in Eastern Europe, in Europe generally, not just Eastern Europe, when Hitler came to power, when it was controlled by him. Why people didn't believe the book? Again, because it was unimaginable. So they thought it was the rantings of a madman. Well, it may have been the rantings of a madman, but once he had power, he was able to enforce all of his rantings.
In November 1932, there were the last 3 elections in Germany, in Republican Germany before Hitler. And the Nazis lost 2 million votes and 34 places in the German parliament. That is when they came into power, because the conservative right wing thought that now that the Nazis were no longer a threat to them. And they, together with the Nazis, they would be a majority.
The conservative parties in the government said, oh, we'll be able to control him. He'll be our front. We'll give him the chancellorship, but we'll really control him. Well, within a very short time, he was controlling them. He won the army over to his side. It wasn't clear that the army would support him. He was a genius. He was a genius in terms of propaganda. He was a genius in terms of controlling his enemies.
It's fortunate, in my opinion, that there wasn't television then, or there wasn't internet, etc. I think he would have been able to convince the whole world. I don't know if America would have gone to war with him either. And we see that America did not go to war until he declared war on the United States. Germany declared war. He had that master stroke of being able to bamboozle everybody, all people at the same time. He absolutely bamboozled the whole world.
He wants to create a totalitarian government. So at the end of February, the Nazis stage a fire in the Reichstag, blame it on a Dutch communist. This frightens enough people in the Reichstag that they enable Hitler, it's known as the Enabling Act, in March 1933 to give him power for 1 year. He uses that 1 year to consolidate his power completely and then control everything. No free press, no free parties, which is why that same month, March 33, Hitler creates the first concentration camp in Dachau, outside of Munich, in order to put their political enemies of the state, communists, socialists, Jews included, but not specifically geared against Jews.
Hitler moved very quickly to silence any opposition to his power. It is estimated in the first months after the Enabling Act, the Nazis murdered 40,000 people. Armageddon for the world, and especially the Jews, was fast approaching.
German Jewry in 1933, when Hitler came to power, thought that this was a transitory phenomenon. It wouldn't last. Nobody thought that Hitler was going to carry on being the Chancellor of Germany for more than a couple of years. The German people would remove him sooner or later.
There's a letter that the Orthodox rabbis of Germany wrote to Hitler upon his assuming the chancellorship of Germany. And the letter says, you know, we congratulate you, we're glad that you made it, and we know you're going to treat us well, and you know that you understand that we're part of the German nation. You read the letter today, you weep. But that's perfect hindsight, right?
Now, another direction of reaction of German Jews in the beginning was to reorganize, to establish a roof organization for German Jewry. And they start with the re-education of the German Jews, many of whom were secularized and were not already estranged from their Jewish roots, and bringing in Jewish values and teaching Jewish history. A new feeling of Jewish identity rises, and that is a process which is called Aufbau im Untergang, that is building up when the situation is declining.
The regeneration of Jewish culture, which was something quite unexpected. German Jewry turned into itself. Why are we Jews? They didn't become Orthodox, but from a liberal religious point of view and from a secular point of view, there was a turning inwards, if you like, an attempt to see what Jewish culture was all about. The Bible was translated into German. There was a tremendous flowering of Jewish culture in Germany. More books on Jewish themes were published between 33 and 38 than in the 100 years before that. The leadership stood up. They couldn't stood up against the Nazis. There was no possibility of that. but they stood up to the Nazis. In other words, they did not cringe, they did not beg, they tried to maintain their honor and their cultural or moral superiority. And this is very important, because the image that many, especially many Jewish people today have, is that the Jews of Germany sort of morally collapsed. This is absolutely untrue.
Nazi violence against the Jews was not limited to the street. Jewish students and professors were expelled from universities, and civil servants were removed from office. Hitler began to espouse his scientific racial theories into the mainstream of daily German life. This theory placed the Aryan race, represented by the Germans, as the highest prototypical human being. Jews, Slavs, and Gypsies, and other Untermenschen, subhumans, were deemed to be the lowest of animals, designated for slavery and extinction.
That idea of social Darwinism, which was a quasi-science, was believed by scientists, by professors, by biologists, etc., created a climate. And the climate was that inferior people, people with handicaps that are a burden on the state, should somehow be eliminated. Hitler destroyed 75,000 mental patients. Doctors and nurses in the insane asylums in Germany in the 1930s killed their patients. The world said, great, it's not a problem. That gave Hitler the idea, if you can kill 75,000 people whom he deemed to be inferior, you can certainly kill a few million Jews who certainly are inferior. And the world won't say anything then either.
In Hitler's eyes, the superior German race is threatened by this inferior race, and a particular way which has made them threatening is that they have, in terms of clothing, habits, and language, so assimilated into German society, of which they're a little less than 1%, that makes them all the more dangerous, because people can't tell. Let me give you an example from my personal experience in this regard. In the 1930s, late 30s, on the mistaken belief that Walt Disney was Jewish, the Nazis banned Mickey Mouse. I thought that was terrible. But if you ask, why are they banning Mickey Mouse? They are banning not just because they believe that Walt Disney is Jewish. They know that people can't tell that Pluto and Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse are Jewish. It's very dangerous to have infiltrated into the culture of a society things that people can't tell apart. And so by a series of steps and stages, they try to segregate what Jewish population there is and to chase as much of it out of the country as possible, and eventually, of course, to kill any that they can get a hold of.
The whole idea of racial anti-Semitism as against religious anti-Semitism is what destroyed the Jews. If you're a race, so then there's no way to change it. Religion, you can bow out, right? You can convert, you can just say, I'm not religious, whatever. But if you're a race, if that's your DNA, if it's in your blood, then you're doomed.
But in the 1930s, who was really listening to Hitler, especially his rantings against the Jews? The world was too busy trying to solve its own problems.
Roosevelt is the nation's idol here today. Thousands of Americans are here to cheer the birth of a new era in national affairs, a New Deal era, which is supposed to pull the country out of its chaos.
FDR becomes president of a country that is in terrible economic shape. And that was his first priority, getting Americans back to work, putting the banks on a secure footing, doing everything possible domestically for this country.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt instituted the New Deal, which created numerous programs to help those affected worst by the Depression and to hasten America's economic recovery. But in March 1933, some 13 million people were still out of work. The stock market had lost almost 89% of its value, and virtually every bank was closed for business. It would take time to see the effects of the New Deal.
He also faced a growing sense of political isolationism, and this is very important. America had been founded on the notion that we're not going to get involved in European wars. And that is even more prevalent as a sentiment in the 1930s, when people think we went to war in Europe to make the world safe for democracy, and what do we have on the European continent? We have fascism in Italy, we have communism in the Soviet Union, and we have Nazism in Germany. That's not our affair. We're staying out of it.
The United States was neutral. There's 3,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean between them and the continent of Europe. They don't want to open their doors to massive immigration, lest these people take away jobs, lest Jews bring in some alien communist views. All of this increases also anti-Semitism in the 1930s. And all of this plays together to explain why Roosevelt is not going to take active steps to challenge Congress and the public opinion, which does not want to get involved in the ills of Europe.
Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, delighted at the failure of the capitalist system, predicted its demise and the inevitable triumph of communism in world society. The Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, was also consolidating his own power by purging the political and military ranks of anyone, real or imagined, that he believed was a danger to him.
In 1934, Stalin began a massive nationwide reign of terror, the so-called Great Purges. All of the leading oppositioners to Stalin, whether from the left or the right, were tried in public show trials in Moscow, were convicted of treason, having confessed to the most absurd, unimaginable crimes, and executed. That escalated between 1934 and 1939 to the point where millions, and we still do not know any precise number, millions of Soviet citizens were arrested, sent to labor camps, imprisoned, or shot. Most of the people in labor camps, of course, did not survive there, so in effect, they too were killed.
It is an ironic historical footnote that Stalin's head of secret police, his foreign minister, and even his brother-in-law were all Jews. Eventually, most of the top-ranking Jews in Soviet power were ultimately purged and executed.
The terrible irony of this is that Stalin purged the Soviet armed forces of its leadership. For example, 110 out of 195 divisional commanders were removed 2, 3, and 4 years before the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. And this involved a tremendous weakening of the ability of the Soviet armed forces to withstand the Nazi invasion.
In Germany, in a symbolic act of ominous significance, on May 10, 1933, an event took place that publicly ushered in an era of Nazi state censorship and cultural control.
2 months only after the Enabling Act gave Hitler total power for a year, There was on the 10th of May a massive book burning in Germany of all books that the Nazi Party believed were pernicious to the German pure Aryan mind. Naturally, German books written by Jews, including Freud and all the other greats, were thrown in to the bonfires. In the 19th century, the great German poet Heinrich Heine said, "A country that burns books may well end up burning bodies." He didn't realize how accurately he prophesied.
The Jews in Germany were very comfortable. They thought, we're German to the core, right? So they're German Lutherans and German Catholics, they're German Jews, but we're all Germans. And German Jewry, the harder it tried to assimilate, the greater the anti-Semitism. No matter what they did, they weren't German enough.
So when Germany starts to persecute Jews, and the persecution has been described as salami tactics, slice by slice by slice. First people are fired from the public sector job, then other jobs, then they can't own stores, then they can't sit on certain benches, then they can't swim in the swimming pools, and it gets worse and worse. And of course, one of the turning points is in the fall of 1935, when the Nuremberg laws are issued.
The Nuremberg laws of 1935 deprived all Jews of their German citizenship and made them state subjects. Jews were to be persecuted. And even those Germans who believed themselves not Jewish but had a Jewish ancestor 4 generations back were now defined as Jewish. Marriages between Jews and non-Jews were invalidated, and even Jews who had converted to Christianity were targeted. Jews were barred from working in the hospitals, government offices, banks, and major companies. Seemingly overnight, more than 100,000 Jews were suddenly unable to make a living.
Well, this was a preparation for removing them, chasing them out of Germany. This was a policy between 1935 and 1938, in fact between 1933 and 1938, to get rid of the Jews by exporting them somewhere else.
And by this point, many German Jews want to get out of Germany. And in fact, over half of the German Jews do leave Germany. So where do they go? They go to places that look very safe. They go to Paris, they go to Amsterdam, they go to Brussels, places that turn out not to be so safe. The most famous of all the stories, of course, because of her book, is Anna Frank's family that leaves Germany and goes to Amsterdam and thinks it's very safe in Amsterdam. And by this point, and this is before Nazism, in the 1920s, America institutes something called the quota system, which sets a quota for how many people can come from each country. And the quota system is designed to keep America white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, Northern European. It heavily favors people coming from Northern Europe. It heavily discriminates against people coming from Eastern Europe, Jews, Catholics. So Jews who want to come from Germany cannot come in freely. It's very hard. If they're trying to leave from Eastern Europe, it's even harder.
With America and most of the world's doors closed to mass Jewish emigration, one surprising country, as late as 1937, still allowed Jews with financial means to immigrate, and that was British-controlled Palestine.
Those Jews who had a bit of capital and could smuggle it out of the country, they could get into Palestine with no problem at all, because according to the British instructions, those capitalists, namely people with more than 1,000 English pounds, could get a certificate no matter what, as many as they wanted to. About 50,000 Jews from Germany immigrated to Palestine during those years. Now, the exceptional thing about this immigration wave was that here, for the first time in the history of immigration to Palestine, the Jews who came from abroad were on a higher cultural, economic, and social level than the Jews in Palestine. This was a very important addition to the makeup of Jewish society in Palestine. Now, we have to understand the importance of this period. There was here a discrepancy. While the Jewish world, the Jewish people in Europe were undergoing one of the worst periods in their existence, Palestine knew prosperity and growth and a promise of a future for the Jews. So for the first time in Jewish history, Palestine became the main country for Jewish immigration, the main country for Jewish refuge. And so, in a way, the balance between Europe and Palestine changed.
What was remarkable looking back at the interwar period from the end of World War I in 1918 through to the 1930s was, despite the difficulties, the resurgence and vibrancy of Jewish life, not only in Palestine, but especially in Eastern Europe.
Eastern European Jewry was a very vital and energetic place. There were many competitors, so to speak, on the Jewish street. First of all, the yeshivot in Lithuania revived themselves and became very influential, produced great people. The Hasidic courts in Poland and Galicia and Hungary also became strong, but they were in competition with the secularization of the Jewish people, with the fact that a large proportion of the Jewish people no longer were observant and followed different gods. One of the gods was the left, communism, socialism. They felt that they're doing, so to speak, God's work in opposing religion. And this competition on the street, in newspapers, in essays, all of this made for a very, very vibrant Jewish life, almost a chaotic Jewish life, because so much was going on and everyone seemed to be against everyone.
In the interwar period in Poland, the Bund was one of many actors on the Jewish political street. Agudas Yisrael, Mizrahi, various Zionist organizations, left Poalitzian, right Poalitzian, a huge plethora of Jewish organizations, each with its own newspaper, with its own football club, with its own schools. Es ist gewesen a lebendige Welt.
How deeply this divided Jewry is reflected in the story of one family, the family of Mordechai Tenenbaum in Poland.
This family was a religious family. The parents were religious, but in the crisis of the interwar period, each of the 6 children chose a different Jewish direction. One became a Bundist, another became more religious. Mordechai himself was later the leader of the Zionist underground in the Bialystok ghetto. And so we can see how the crisis of the period impacted on one family. All remained Jews, but they chose different paths.
Then there also were developments, new developments. Women's education in Eastern Europe, which until the First World War was nil, except for individuals, but as a system didn't exist. And now the Beis Yaakov school system was created. Sarah Schneerer was able to enlist the aid of great rabbis and Hasidic leaders to back it. And now you had tens of thousands of religious women that attended school, that were literate. That was a great change, a great revolution, and it was a step towards modernity. Eastern European Jewish life was also influenced by technological advance. Radio, Jewish theater reflected different viewpoints. Great cantors gave concerts and made records, the old vinyl 78 records, and it was a new world.
Despite all the changes, social, political, philosophical and economic, and the defection of so many Jews from traditional Judaism, Orthodox life, especially in Poland and Lithuania, remains strong and highly motivated.
Eastern European Jewish life in its religious sector was led by such luminaries as Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan, known as the Chafetz Chaim, and Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grodzinski, who was the untitled rabbi of Vilna and really the strong man of the Lithuanian Jewish world. And the Hasidic world was led by the Ger Rebbe and the other rebbeim that existed then that had large and powerful courts. You had very, very strong leadership, and you had very powerful people.
With the pressure on Jews to abandon their faith and toe the communist line increasing in the Soviet Union, and the winds of discrimination and danger blowing stronger and stronger in Germany, the troubling question is, why did the Jews not emigrate en masse from Europe or Eastern Europe at that time?
One has to realize that because the Nazis did not say exactly what they were going to do with the Jews couldn't have known. There was no threat of murder before 1939. And so the reaction that one finds today, why didn't the German Jews realize what was going on? They couldn't have realized because even the Nazis didn't know what was going to happen. Anything like what we know today as the Holocaust was in no one's mind, not in the German minds, not in the Jewish minds.
Some groups like the Gera Hasidim and Mizrahi, the religious Zionists, did emigrate to Palestine in the 1930s. But the majority of the Orthodox and the Bundists, for different reasons, were against Zionism. The Bundists believed in a social brotherhood and hoped to rebuild Polish society on socialist principles and thereby erase anti-Semitism. Many Orthodox leaders discouraged their religious followers from emigrating to Palestine in the 1930s because they were afraid of the influence of the secular culture of the Zionist Yeshuv. For these Orthodox leaders, the risk of going to a secularized no man's land versus the established Orthodox infrastructure that existed in Poland was simply too great.
It's easy to say to leave, but who, where, and how? You know, you're talking about millions of people. How do you move them? And we know that inertia is a great force. It's not easy for people to move. And then especially the people who had wealth, businesses, real estate, etc., they are loath to leave because they have to give up everything. It's those that have nothing that find it easier to leave. And because of that, therefore, that we had religious groups that said, you're not allowed to leave, we have to stay here till the Messiah comes. They said, you can't go to America because there nobody can be Torah observant. You can't go to the land of Israel because there somehow it's controlled by the secularists. All Judaism will be destroyed. So we'll stay here and fight it out. The communists, for instance, said we have to stay here and build communism. It's cowardly to leave. And the liberals said, how can you leave? You know, Germany is our fatherland. How can we abandon it now in the time of trouble? We have to stay here and rectify the situation. So again, in retrospect, it's all frightening how blind everybody was, but that's because we have perfect hindsight. They did not have that. What the Holocaust was unimaginable. It was unimaginable to the world generally and to the Jewish world particularly.
In 1936, a major civil war broke out in Spain, uniting Hitler and Italy's Mussolini with General Francisco Franco on the right, against the Soviet Union backing the Spanish leftists. The Spanish Civil War allowed Germany to test the superiority of its new weaponry.
The Spanish Civil War was a testing ground for Hitler's armies, for the Air Force, for the Luftwaffe, for the Panzers, for everything, and it was a testing ground diplomatically. Because neither England nor France said, get out of the war or we're going to go against you. He believed that the Western democracies would never go to war with him. That we're too weak, too pacifist. That was one of his miscalculations.
By the mid-1930s, Hitler was supremely confident. And this confidence fueled his drive to not only re-empower Germany and restore it to its former glory, but to prepare it for world domination. However, to do that, Germany needed to expand territorially.
A concept that not only Hitler but others in Germany used a great deal was the German word Lebensraum, and translated into English is living space. A critical point that runs through all of Hitler's writings and speeches was that the German race must be able to feed itself on its own soil. And that therefore meant that the territory you conquered for your living space would have to be emptied of non-German people who were already there. They could be expelled or they could be killed, but they couldn't be Germanized. Only soil can be Germanized.
The very first major bold move Hitler does is in 1936. He occupies once again the Rhineland that had been given over by the Versailles Peace Treaty to France. His generals before this were panic-stricken. We're not ready for war. The French will quickly overcome us. And Hitler says, follow me. He really believed that God was with him. He was on a crusade, as he saw it in apocalyptic terms, for the benefit of the world. And in fact, not a shot is fired. This also increases clearly his popularity in Germany. It's the same year that summer he stages the Olympics in Berlin, which is a major triumph clearly for the so-called Aryan race.
In 1936, the Olympics were held in Berlin. The United States debated whether or not it should even participate. There were Jewish athletes that also had to decide whether or not they would participate. In the end, they joined the American team, but when they came to Berlin, the American track team decided that they would not use Jewish athletes in the games. They were afraid that they would embarrass Hitler if a Jewish athlete won. It sent a subliminal message to Hitler, and the message was, America will not stand up for its Jews. It was a terrible message to send to a lethal madman.
The Olympics was a chance for Germany to show the world what it had accomplished. And people came away from the Olympics enthralled by what they saw. They didn't see people being beaten up. They didn't see Jews being persecuted. They saw a country where people were working. They saw a country where nobody was selling apples on the street, as was still the case in the United States. They saw new buildings. They saw a grand and glorious operation. And they came back and they said, we didn't see anybody be persecuted. What is this all about? Of course, the persecution had gone underground for the duration of the Olympics.
Hitler's plans for rebuilding the German economy were proving very successful. He believed that creating great monumental works would set the German people back to work and revitalize the economy, and it did. The rearmament of Germany was also progressing rapidly. In 1936, Hitler had presented a 4-year plan to ready his country for war. He told his advisors that the big war should be won by 1942 or 44 at the latest. But first, he had to prepare the groundwork to defuse and make sure that the countries surrounding him would not try to stop him.
Hitler is himself very concerned in the first years of his rule that there will be preventive action against Germany. And so he does various things to fool people. He signs a non-aggression pact with Poland. He renews a credit agreement with the Soviet Union. He signs a concordat with the Vatican. Now all of these get broken, and he plans to do that, but it calms people down.
With Germany's advantage of an early head start on rearmament, Hitler knew he had to strike before England, France, and America could rearm and oppose him. In his plan to expand his borders and unite the German-speaking countries of Europe, Adolf Hitler now turned his sights on Germany's neighbor, Austria.
On March the 12th, 1938, without warning, the German armies marched over the Austrian border. It was really only a full-scale invasion test, and Hitler rode in triumph into Vienna. Even the very name of Austria disappeared from the map.
He walks in, and the League of Nations, which is moribund, which is dormant, does nothing. The only two powers which really could have stopped him, the US is neutral, it's not even in the League of Nations, are Britain and France, and they appease him. They don't want to have another World War I.
The Austrians welcomed the Germans with open arms. And Austria's Jewish community, which I believe was around 200,000, suddenly faces the anti-Semitic regulations which have taken 6 years to put in place in Germany. In Austria, it happens overnight. One day you're a free Jew in Vienna living your life. The next day you can't work in certain places, you can't live in certain places, you must turn in your money, you must turn in your possessions.
Now Hitler's got all these extra Jews on his hands. What's he going to do? This is the real change, because now the call is sent to a colorless bureaucrat. He may have been 37 or 38, named Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann is in fact the expert in the Gestapo, or secret police. Eichmann begins in March of 38 to forcibly take everything in his own hands, and realizing this is where he can win his spurs, gain real public acclaim, start to forcibly push Jews out of Austria.
With the noose tightening and the position of the Jews deteriorating in Germany and Eastern Europe, the question of where Jewish refugees would go forced world leaders to at least discuss the problem.
The very first step that Roosevelt takes to respond to public opinion in England and America to do something for refugees is in July of 1938, convening in Evian, in France, a conference on refugees coming from Germany and Austria. Many countries are not involved, especially Poland, because that has over 3 million Jews, whereas Germany had a little over 500,000 to start with in 1933. But already, even before Evian, the United States representative said, we're not changing our immigration laws. Mainly, we continue the restrictions. As a result, if they, the nations at Evian, see the US is not taking a lead, why should they? The British have an additional problem: Palestine.
The British went into the new phase of saying, the Jews are in our pocket anyway. We are their only ally in the world. We have nothing to worry about them. But the Arabs control imperial roads, the Suez Canal, the oil in Iraq, so we have to appease the Arabs. And the result was the White Paper of 1939, which said loud and clear that the growth of the Jewish community in Palestine can be stopped. It says that within 10 years, there will be Jewish immigration into the country, all in all of 75,000 Jews, and nothing more.
With Arab and Jew fighting at that time, the Arabs maintaining a revolt from 1936 onward to 39, they don't want to open the accessible haven and the most obvious haven, i.e. the Promised Land, to the Jews. So already at Evian, July 38, more than a year before the war erupts, no nation of major import says, fine, we'll open our doors to Jews. The world signals its indifference, or worse, to the Jewish tragedy.
A tragic example of exclusionist immigration policies were the 939 refugees from Germany who sailed to Cuba on board the St. Louis. Barred from entering Cuba, they were also turned away by America and Canada. Eventually, the St. Louis sailed back to Europe, where England, Belgium, and Holland accepted the refugees. Unfortunately, later over 250 of them perished in the Holocaust. The Jews of Germany were caught in a no-win situation. They were rejected by most of the outside world and their Nazi-controlled homeland.
You couldn't have the Jews stay. But they were not leaving in large enough numbers. So you need to exercise some pressure on them, some harsh, very harsh pressure, in order for them to go, to run. And then something happened which helped them do that. And that is a young Jew by the name of Herschel Greenspan.
Herschel decides, I'm willing to sacrifice my life if necessary. I have to alert the world to the crisis that my people are facing, not only in that no man's land, but always and everywhere under Hitler. Goes to the German embassy in Paris in the hope of killing the German ambassador there. He's not going to run away. He's ready to come to trial in order that the world will find out about the tragic plight of his brethren. The German ambassador is not there. German Secretary von Rath, who ironically is an anti-Nazi secretly, comes to receive Greenspan. Greenspan doesn't know this is the ambassador, and so he shoots him, as it turns out, mortally. It's the night of November 8th. Here it's clearly orchestrated. They're only waiting for the proper incident to set it all off. The explosion follows, which we now call Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht getting its name from the shattered glass of shops and burned synagogues and so forth all around occupied Germany.
This was the sign, with Hitler's explicit approval, for the Nazi party and the Nazi thugs to do something that was really had been prepared before, and that is attack Jews all over Germany. Attack them physically, burn down their synagogues, and arrest large numbers of Jewish males, approximately 26,000. Put them in concentration camps so that their families would do everything they could to get them out. And the only way they could get out of the concentration camps if the Nazis were shown a visa or some kind of paper that enabled the Jews to leave.
Of the things that happened at that time, two really disturbed me the most. One was that the synagogue that we attended in Hanover had been burned and was eventually, of course, leveled. That whole notion of burning what the Germans call a Gotteshaus, a house of God, shook me up probably more than anything else. That people were sometimes nasty to each other, and that in the First World War they tried to kill each other and had wounded my father. Well, it's not nice, but that people do nasty things to people was something I understood. But what they had against God, that they would burn down his house, that seemed somehow almost beyond belief to me. The other thing that happened was that a couple of days after, it would have been around the 10th or 11th of November, I'm in the class with all the other boys. The principal came into the room and read the order that no Jews were allowed in the regular school, and another boy and I got up, collected our things, and left. That was, for me, I must say, such a traumatic experience, and that really shook me up.
Kristallnacht was not only the destruction of the synagogues throughout Germany and the smashing of all of the windows of Jewish shops and homes and apartments, and Jews were forced to wear signs that said, "I'm Germany's misfortune, I'm a pig, I'm an exploiter." That was a public shaming that didn't exist from medieval times until that time. And all of a sudden it began to sink in how malevolent this danger was. That Hitler really meant what he said in Mein Kampf, and that the Jewish world was in danger.
And that, in fact, is what Göring says after Kristallnacht. I would not want to be a Jew in Germany today. Kristallnacht is vital for another reason. With Kristallnacht, the bureaucrats take over. They meet. Eichmann is now put in charge not only of the Jews in occupied Austria, but of any future place where the Germans are going to gain control of Jews. Eichmann, from that day on, will really be pulling all the strings of the so-called final solution of the Jewish question.
The people of Germany, by now inculcated with the notion that Jews were too prominent and too integrated into German society, supported these anti-Jewish atrocities. In the eyes of the German people, and to the world at large, Hitler seemed to be unstoppable.
The next major step that Hitler takes in terms of Lebensraum is Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, where many Germans were living and they clearly wanted to be united with a greater Germany. Again, September 38, Hitler threatens war. The Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain of England, steps back. Chamberlain met with Hitler, meeting in Munich, hence the Munich Conference, in September 1938. What to do with the Sudetenland, that area of Germany given to a free liberal Czechoslovakia after World War I. And basically Hitler said, if you give me this, I'll pull back, there will be no war. Chamberlain comes back to London to cheering crowds, waving in one hand the document signed with Hitler, in the other proverbial British bowler and umbrella, and he says, I bring you peace in our time. It wasn't peace in our time, it was pieces. You're going one by one by one, like the old Pac-Man. You never satisfy a totalitarian dictator. He always wants more. Proof in the pudding is, a few months later, in March of '39, he lops off the rest of Czechoslovakia with its valuable armaments and so forth. They could have stopped him earlier. They did not.
Whatever people outside Germany think of the Munich Agreement, we have to remember that Hitler thought of it as the greatest mistake of his life, that he should have gone to war then, when the US wasn't going to help anybody, when the British dominions, Canada, Union of South Africa, and Australia, had told the British government, we're not fighting over this mess with Czechoslovakia, you're on your own.
England, France, the United States, they could have stopped Hitler at many points prior to 1939. Why did they not stop him? Not wanting to have another world war, they're prepared to do almost anything, and therefore they're ready to appease him. Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England, Daladier for France, they are gentlemen of the Enlightenment. In their case, that we can rationally sit down with Herr Hitler, as Chamberlain referred to him, and somehow arrive at a peace. Hitler is not a rationalist. He is a fixated mind, and he knows what he wants to do. They did not take him seriously enough, and when they did, it was too late, and the war erupted.
The Neutrality Act, passed by the United States Congress in November 1939, signaled to England and France that America would not come to their aid if they went to war with Germany.
And where do you think this is? Right in Madison Square Garden, USA. And this is Fritz Kuhn, leader of a German-American Bund, hiding behind the American flag, but taking his orders from Berlin and copying the methods of Berlin.
In this charged atmosphere, Jewish communal leaders in the US assumed a low profile, which would continue throughout World War II. Condemnation of Hitler and his brutality towards Jews was muted, and little was done to persuade the US government to allow Jewish refugees to enter America.
There was a great deal of open anti-Semitism and discrimination and bigotry against Jews. You couldn't go to every hotel. You couldn't go to every university. You couldn't be the chairman of a Forbes 500 company. And there was a quota against Jewish immigration. And the Jews in the United States hunkered down. They also were going to ride it out. And that weakened any influence they could have on the American government.
For Hitler in the 1930s, his main focus was to make sure that the Russians would not militarily go against or prevent Germany from implementing its plan to expand.
But Hitler understands there's a serious problem. Geography is all. To the right of Poland is Russia, the Soviet Union. His major enemy is Bête Noire. This is a massive empire. How can he possibly go into Poland without the Russians counterattacking? So a non-aggression pact is signed between the Germans and the Soviets. They basically agree secretly to divide Poland in half. The western part going to Germany, the eastern part to the Soviet Union, and that is how now Hitler, having the Soviets out of the way, begin the immediate steps to attack Poland and annex that area promised him by the Soviets, and that will happen on the 1st of September 1939.
With Hitler's plans of expansionism beginning to succeed, the master manipulator turned his attention back to the Jews.
At the end of his Reichstag speech, January 30th, 1939, publicized worldwide, Hitler says, if World War breaks out, it will not see the annihilation of the German nation, but of the Jewish race in Europe. Now, one can easily dismiss this simply as verbiage, and many people did not take him seriously. But we always know that actions begin in words.
It takes a very long time for people to grasp that others may have notions that we consider ridiculous and crazy, but others act on their notions, not ours. They act on what they believe. There's probably a very large number of people in this country today who fail to understand that the German ambition in World War II was to conquer the world.
What made Hitler so credible, especially to the German people, was how passionately he believed in what he said. Demonic and perverted as it was, he truly believed that his mission was divine. In the second chapter of Mein Kampf, he said,
"Today I believe that I am acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator. By defending myself against the Jew, I am fighting for the work of the Lord." He saw himself as fighting not only for Germany's glory and vindication and revival of the older German past, but also for the good of mankind. Remember, he says that the Nazi Party wants to exist for 1,000 years. In his mind, there is that image of world domination. It is to redeem the world from the evils of the international poisoner of the world, world Jewry.
Hitler's diatribe against the Jews is a classic example of what the psychologists call projection. We project upon others the faults that we have. So Hitler was the poisoner, and he said the Jews poisoned. Hitler was the hater. He said the Jews are the haters. Hitler is the one that wanted to destroy, and they said the Jews are the ones that want to destroy. Every fault that existed within the Nazi Party, within Hitler's warped mind, he projected upon the Jews. That is classic anti-Semitism.
Meanwhile, Europe and the world teetered on the edge of war. Adolf Hitler's long-planned expansionist vision for Nazi Germany was about to become a reality. On September the 1st, 1939, he made his move.
War. Precisely at dawn on September 1st, without warning, the German Wehrmacht rolled over the Polish border. Before the invasion was 30 minutes old, the planes of the Luftwaffe were over Poland.
Hitler believed that although Britain and France had signed a treaty with Poland, they would maintain their previous policy of appeasement. However, 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This country is at war with Germany.
The day after Hitler crossed the Polish border, France called up her reservists. Within 24 hours, British planes had bombed German warships in the Kiel Canal.
Hitler was stunned, and the world was plunged into a second World War.
By 1939, there was an unstoppable darkness, a palpable darkness that engulfed not only Europe, but engulfed the world generally. And there was no way to stop that momentum. And this darkness provoked World War II, the madman, one madman's idea. It provoked the Holocaust. It brought about the death of tens of millions of people. It created World War II. It reshaped the world. And it brought about the darkest days in the story of the civilization of the human race. All of this a product of this terrible, frightening decade, which was the 1930s.
With the rise to power of Adolf Hitler in the 1930s, one man's distorted vision created a nightmare world of murder, of death, of destruction. Something that was unbelievable at the beginning of the decade was only so believable at its end. Soon the world and all of European Jewry would be in the grip of an unfathomable terror, so vast that neither memory nor history would ever be able to temper or erase it from man's conscience.